Hi everyone, this is Michal from Airhead and welcome to this video where we will talk about 5 of the most recent questions from human performance and limitations. So this is a very interesting and very practical subject. However, it is usually overlooked during the studies, but today I'll try to give you some tips and some useful information regarding some of the more interesting topics. And all the questions that we'll see are the most recent ones seen across all the EASA authorities in the past 30 days. So if you're preparing for the exam, I'm sure this will be quite helpful. So without any further ado, let's jump into question number 1. A pilot is used to landing on small and narrow runways only. Approaching a larger and wider runway can lead to. So this is something that you will experience at least once in your career, especially once you will begin your cross-country flying stage. As you will be approaching to different airports after you've done a lot of circuit work at your local one, you'll see that the runways will change in size, length, and in width. And this is something that in HPL is called size constancy, meaning that the brain takes a mental image of something that it thinks is constant, in this case a runway, and then it scales it up or down based on the feature around it and based on the distances that it believes it's at. And this can be quite dangerous, especially in commercial aviation, where the pilots will begin the flare either very late or very low if they are tricked by this change of size of the runway. And there is a very popular story that I'm sure you've heard before during your training about an RAF pilot. He was flying a jet during a very snowy winter time, and the runway that was his local one has just been cleared of snow. However, it was only cleared of snow in the few meters in the very middle. So once he took off and then he tried to land back, the runway that he was used to was now much narrower, at least in the visual side of things, and he caused an incident, making a lot of damage to the airplane because he simply did not flare at all because he thought he was very high. And when it comes to the wide runways, it is the exact opposite. We think we are extremely close to the runway because the mental image we have in our minds tells us that, okay, this runway looks very big, we must be very close. However, if the runway is wider than we are used to, then of course we'll get this perception much earlier than usually. So if you are used to small runways and you approach to a larger and wider one, you will definitely think you are lower than you are, causing a early or very high round out. And round out is nothing but a stage between your glide portion of the approach and your flare. And now for question number 2. So what is the correct definition of macho? So there are 6 hazardous attitudes that you should remember, and macho is one of them. And what the macho hazardous attitude essentially says is you can consider it something along the lines of, I can do it better than anyone, and I'll do it better than anyone. And of course, the other 6 that you should know, for example, invulnerability, which answers the question of, it won't happen to me, nothing can happen to me, all the bad things happen to other people. And of course, there is also resignation. So what's the point if I can't change it anyway? I have no influence on the situation. Impulsiveness, which basically makes people do something right now and right here without thinking through things. And lastly, we have anti-authority and complacency. So complacency, it's, for example, when you're landing to your local airport, you think, oh, I've done it 1,000 times. So there's no point in breathing or in thinking too much about the current situation. And lastly, anti-authority. So don't tell me what to do. So you can have an anti-authoritative captain being an FO. If he has this hazardous attitude, he will not want to listen to you or his other colleagues. So what is the definition of macho? This will be the person who overestimates perception about himself. And this is one of the 6 hazardous attitudes that you should know and remember. And now the result of automation in cockpits. So actually, when it comes to this question, there is no quite and clear answer. However, something that will help you associate this question with the given scenario is something that Airbus calls its golden rules. So Airbus has published its golden rules, meaning these are the most important things that every pilot flying the Airbus aircraft has to remember. And these are, rule number 1 is fly, navigate, communicate, as we all know. However, rule number 2 is to always use the appropriate amount of automation. Number 3, understand the FMA. And number 4 is to take control if things do not go as expected. And here I want to raise your attention to the rules number 2 and 3. So always use the automation to the appropriate level and understand the flight mode annunciator. And these two come to the use of automation inside of the cockpit. And now, of course, automation helps a lot. It reduces the workload and it helps with awareness. However, it also brings another level of work that did not exist before, which is to monitor the automation and to be aware exactly what is going on and how it's going on. And this is where Airbus put a big emphasis on this here, because they say, yes, use the automation, it's there to help you. However, it's equally important to understand what's going on, to monitoring the flight mode annunciator at all times, and to be aware and to fly the airplane, rather the airplane flying you. So as a result of automation in the cockpit, communication and coordination call for a greater effort on the part of the flight crew members. Because if the airplane starts flying you, and this is very easy to do if you use automation that's not appropriate, or if you do not know what the airplane is doing, it's very easy to fall behind the aircraft and cause a situation that is dangerous or undesirable. And now for question number 4. So when the weather is foggy on approach, a pilot may get the impression that, so when it comes to the weather and flying, there is something that we also need to point out here, and this is one of the visual illusions. And this visual illusion is nothing else that, of course, if something is far away, it seems to be blurry and foggy and doesn't have many details or features or colors. However, when something is very close to us, in that case, the things are sharper, more colorful, and the objects are more distinct. However, a fog or haze or some visibility reducing phenomena when it comes to weather, they'll give you an impression that an object is blurry, foggy, and not sharp, even if it's very close to you. And this is why when you're flying a foggy approach, you will get an impression that an airport or a runway is much further than it actually is, because the image will not be sharp and it will not be clear in your mind, and your brain will translate this as, oh, this object is very far away. And the same can happen when you're approaching a featureless terrain. So remember that approaching a featureless runway will make it very hard to judge the distance and the height, because your brain will use these features to compare against something that you already know. So in case of a foggy approach or any other approach where the visibility is reduced, a pilot may get an impression that the airfield is further than it actually is. And this will make it absolutely correct. And now for question number 5. So this is the last question about nicotine and smoking. You'll see at least 1 or 2 questions about smoking in your actual HPL exam. So which of the following statements are not correct regarding smoking? So I actually chose this question because there is something quite controversial in the answers here, as you can see by the amount of comments. So the nicotine generally will cause 5 key things, and these will be heart attacks, strokes, lung diseases, emphysemas, and cancer. And of course, these might be quite straightforward. However, you can also consider the smoking to increase your physiological altitude by around 5 to 8,000 feet. And this is because smoking will inhibit the ability of your blood to carry oxygen. So it will be much easier for you to become hypoxic. And actually, this will be the most visible during night flying, because as you know, as you go higher and you get less oxygen, your eyes will actually be less efficient. And this is not very visible below 10,000 feet when you fly normally during day. However, if you're flying during night, as low as 5,000 feet, you might be able to start feeling the effects of hypoxia on your sight. And this is particularly felt by people who smoke a lot. And if you have an instructor who smokes a lot, for example, or you fly with a friend who smokes a lot, during night your visibility will be much better. However, the physiological altitude will be from 5 to 8,000 rather than 1 to 3. The abstinence from tobacco can cause irritability and limited ability to concentrate in regular smokers. Of course, this is a withdrawal with anything, and any type of addiction will cause irritability. And then smokers have an increased risk to suffer from myocardial infarction or a stroke. Of course, heart attack or a stroke are one of the 5 consequences of smoking. And lastly, the cancer of urinary tract. And this is the controversial one. And if you do your research, then you'll see that actually the nicotine and smoking is linked to testicular and urinary cancers in some individuals. However, there are also a lot of studies that do not make this direct link. So this last point is slightly controversial. However, generally in the medicine, you can consider that actually smoking and the nicotine, which is the active substance of tobacco, will cause a cancer of the urinary tract. And this makes uh, answer 1 and 5 correct. Nicotine increases actually the nicotine is not a carcinogenic, so this is another one. So nicotine is the active substance of tobacco, and what causes the cancer will be the smokes and the fumes, so not necessarily the nicotine. So number 1 will be incorrect. However, 3 and 5 will be, making 3, 4, 5 the correct answer. And this will be everything for today's episode, where we just went through some of the more interesting questions from HPL. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day or week, and I wish you all the best in the upcoming exams. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments. Until then, bye bye, and I hope to see you in the next video.